we have different groups. We have this national expert groups that should be consistent of all experts in the country working with plant nutrition, from in fact from farmers to suppliers to researchers, advisors, and laboratories, and so on. And then we have the basic group, the farmers group. We call it crop nutrition clubs that should consist of farmers. And this meeting today is for the national expert group that should have a meeting across the countries, and the purpose is to discuss across the countries. Sarah will sooner give a more detailed introduction. We have a program that says that Sarah Kendall will in a moment give a brief review of the purpose of the NUTRI-CHECK network, and then David Wall from TICAS will bring the first results from the project about understanding the barriers to adopt tools and technologies based on investigation we all have done in our countries. Then there will be a group discussion. Then we will have a presentation from the Netherlands by Milan Fransen, and he will also talk of the results from the project about digital tools for nutrient management. And then we will have two other presentations that will present new tools in plant nutrition by Sylvester Bradley from ADAS, and one from Denmark with Torkild Birkmose. It should be the program. A little technical information. We will record the meeting here after the introduction. We want you to shut all your microphones, and the questions should be given in the chat. And if we have time after each presentation, we will read up the questions for the presenter and then try to answer them. Otherwise, they will be answered in the chat afterwards. You can see that you can activate the chat in the button, and also then that you must turn off your microphone and cameras. And if you go into the chat, it will look like this, and you can write a message or a question in the right corner. Then we also try to have a group discussion, and it means that you will be split up in groups later on, and it will be done automatically. And there will be a question to answer in the group, and each group will have their own facilitator. And there will only be 5 minutes for presentation of the members of the group, 15 minutes for group discussion, and 5 minutes to catch up. But Randy Viborg, here, my colleague, will give you a more detailed introduction later on. So thank you for all of you to participate in this, and then I will handle the word to Sarah.
Hopefully that's come through okay, and you can see my screen now. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Kendall. I work for an organisation called ADAS in the UK, and it gives me great pleasure to be here to give an overview of NUTRI-CHECK Net as the scientific coordinator of the project. Most of you will already have had an introduction to the project through your respective national expert groups, but I'm pleased to give a brief overview of the project and what we hope to achieve. So NUTRI-CHECK Net is a trans-European project where we are working across 9 European countries with 10 different project partners. And the project is a thematic network project. And what this means is that rather than performing research to generate new knowledge, we are striving to make the best use of the knowledge that is already available. And what we hope the project will achieve is to maximise site-specific precision in managing the nutrition of European arable crops. Of course, the remit of what we're doing in the NUTRI-CHECK Net project aligns with the Green Deal Farm to Fork strategy. And this project will contribute towards reducing nutrient losses by at least 50% whilst ensuring no deterioration in soil fertility. So arable farms in the EU now face the challenge of reinstating increases in productivity whilst rapidly adopting more sustainable, more circular nutrition systems with much less de novo nutrient use, hence more nutrient recycling, in order to bring the major reductions needed in nutrient losses. So the NUTRI-CHECK Net project has been inspired by the success of the Yield Enhancement Network that was initiated by ADAS in the UK more than 10 years ago. And through this network, we developed a spin-off network called Yen Nutrition, which was launched in 2020. And Roger Sylvester Bradley, my colleague, will talk about this in more detail in his presentation later in the meeting. But over the 10 years that the Yen has been running, we have accumulated more than 5,000 yields and explanatory data to support those yields. We've now built a data set of grain nutrient information as part of this, and this has really inspired and encouraged our desire to support farms in checking their nutrient strategies and balancing their inputs and outputs. The NUTRI-CHECK Net project is dealing with the crop nutrition decision-making process, dealing with how farms determine how much fertilizer to buy, how much and when to apply, the methods that support the adoption of these decisions, and how farms check on the outcome of the decisions that they've made and ultimately try and assess if they were successful or not. We manage crops field by field, and inorganic nutrients are the most expensive inputs for crop production, both from an economic and also an environmental perspective. And we know that nutrient inputs show important losses. So surely crop managers must measure not only the nutrients that they buy and apply to each field, but also the nutrient outputs. What we hope NUTRI-CHECK Net will really emphasise is the value of monitoring and better measurements. So if we consider nutrient management as a process, we've got nutrient inputs and nutrient outputs, as well as soil storage of the nutrients. And then we've got losses to air and we've got losses to water. But if we're going to manage this process, and particularly if we are going to improve, then we need to make more measurements. We are often good at measuring what is bought and applied, And often we measure soil availability of a few nutrients, P, K, magnesium, sometimes nitrogen, and in some cases, minor nutrients as well. But in some cases, these measures can be not particularly reliable or accurate. Sometimes we also measure the nutrients in the young crop through tissue analysis. But this doesn't tell us the success of the way we are managing crop nutrition necessarily. We almost never measure the nutrients that are harvested and removed from the field. So in general, farmers have a poor knowledge of nutrient balances or losses at a field level. And what we hope is that by utilising the best tools and the best technologies available to farmers, through emphasising the value of improved measurements and monitoring, we can help to optimise nutrient management across Europe. So just to give a brief overview of the project, so our aim is to improve the precision of crop nutrition by compiling nutrition decision tools, promoting farm-by-farm nutrient checking, and importantly, facilitating knowledge exchange. Within the project, we are focusing on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But a lot of the discussions that I know are ongoing with the crop nutrition clubs and the national expert groups, this spills over into other macro and micronutrients. So we hope that there is what we talk about for those macronutrients in some cases is that information can be transferred across other nutrients as well. Within the project, we're having a focus on wheat, maize and potatoes. But again, there's been discussions around other crops as well, where the information can be relevant. A NUTRI-CHECK Net started at the beginning of this year and it will run through to the end of December 2025. And what's really important is, as a thematic network, the way in which we're working, co-creating between farmers, advisors and experts, this really sits at the heart of our project. So we need to make sure that we're listening to farmers, that we're listening to stakeholders, so that the outputs at the end of the project are useful and relevant. And to do this, our outreach, so the communication and dissemination activities that we have planned are wide-reaching, and we want to be trying to engage with as many farmers and as many members of the industry as possible to make sure that we can achieve that impact. So the project has 5 objectives, the first being to establish the NUTRI-CHECK network to really transform crop nutrition in Europe. And so I'm really pleased that today is the first instance in which we bring together our national expert groups to really form the NUTRI-CHECK network. We've been busy starting to create an inventory of crop nutritional decision tools to summarise the current knowledge and also best practices, and Milan will talk about some of these tools a bit later in the meeting. The crop nutrition clubs have a role in really helping us to evaluate these decision tools, and those activities will really kind of kick off as we move into the coming season. We're also going to develop NUTRI-CHECK Net platform, which will act as a central point to share the tools widely. And also, as I've mentioned, this dissemination part of the project is really important. And this will include liaison with other relevant EIP Agri operational groups and thematic networks as well. I've mentioned that co-creation between farmers, industry stakeholders and researchers is fundamental to the NUTRI-CHECK Net project. And this slide helps to highlight how stakeholder interactions work in the project. So in all partner countries, we have 2 to 3 crop nutrition clubs which are groups of farmers who have a common interest in improving nutrient management on their farms. And the majority of the participants in this webinar are members of national expert groups. And this includes representation from some of the crop nutrition clubs as well. And together, the national expert groups come together to form one collective NUTRI-CHECK network. So that is what is represented in this meeting today. The members of the crop nutrition clubs have already provided us with information to identify what their current challenges are around the uptake of new tools and technologies. And David's going to share some of the results from this survey in the next presentation. As members of national expert groups, some of you will already have helped to provide context to these challenges by feeding into and participating in interviews earlier in the year. And this information will really help to feed into the development of a prioritization methodology that will help us to subselect tools and technologies that have been compiled through an inventory. The crop nutrition clubs then have a fundamental role in helping to evaluate the tools and technologies. And this is really informing us about what works for them and what doesn't. And this will feed into a cost benefit analysis of those tools. And together, this information will feed into how we develop as a network a series of best practices. And we envisage that some of these may be holistic components of the nutrient management process rather than necessarily focusing on specific tools in all instances. And throughout the project, and once the best practices have been defined and across all stakeholder levels, we must disseminate the lessons and the learnings that we have in a widespread manner to maximise the input of our work within the project. So I've mentioned that we are creating an inventory in the project, and this will have 3 sections. So focusing on recommendation systems. So we want to understand current best practices in each of the partner countries. There will also be a component focusing on research projects. So we want to make connections and share outputs from other research projects, and also to look for evidence to support tools and recommendations. And then the third component will focus on identifying the tools that enable farmers to improve their nutrient management. And we're particularly interested in those approaches that focus on this measure to manage approach. We're also creating a customized NUTRI-CHECK Net platform, and this has been done by the Agricultural University of Athens. And this will really create a platform to share the contents of the inventory widely. And a proof of concept version should be ready at the end of February in 2024. And we will sort feedback on the development as this continues. So we would be really pleased if you will engage with the platform when that's when it's ready for you to do so. And importantly, there will also be an API link to the EU Farm Book platform to try and make sure that the kind of sharing of this information is done in a joined up way. And I just want to mention the communication and dissemination part of the project, because this is really fundamental. So we will be focusing on making sure we disseminate the knowledge that's already available, and as we really generate those best practices as we go through the project. So this is going to include things like videos to describe the project in each crop nutrition club, press articles, webinars, in-field demonstration events, leaflets and fact sheets, and obviously presence on social media and practice abstracts. So this is just to urge you as participants of the network and in your national expert groups to please get involved in helping to communicate and disseminate the project as we go through the project. So I'm going to end my presentation there, and I hope that gives you a kind of clear understanding of what we're trying to do within the project. And I think I'm now going to hand over to David, who's going to talk us through some of the results from the survey that we've carried out to really try and understand what the farmers' needs are.
And please let me know when it's available, when it's up there.
I can see that, David. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding the barriers to adopt tools and technologies on farms. First and foremost, I must acknowledge Carl Redmond, who's my colleague here at Teagasc in Ireland, but more so all the project partners and many of you as NEG members who've contributed to the study that I'm going to outline and the results that we've generated. So we've engaged many stakeholders in this, including yourselves. So okay, so what's all this about? First and foremost, the task at hand is to identify farmers' needs and stakeholder drivers to increase precision in crop nutrition. And the overall aim of this piece of work as part of the wider network is to identify the primary needs and drivers of farmers to increase the precision of crop nutrition right across Europe. The objectives, primarily to capture the urgent needs of farmers in relation to crop nutrition and the use or lack of use, I suppose, of many of nutrient management decision tools, to identify the gaps and barriers for the uptake of these crop nutrition tools. So why aren't some farmers adopting these? What are the challenges that presents when using some of the technologies, and what are the experiences? And then ultimately what we want to do is provide feedback on the stakeholder needs back into the network and back into the subsequent work packages that we'll be conducting over the next couple of years. So first and foremost, who's our audience? Who are the relevant stakeholders that we're trying to engage? And as you can see here, the farmer is at the center of all this, the farmer or the land manager as they may be. And they're getting their cues or getting information, services, etc., from many stakeholders. And I may not even have covered everybody in the stakeholder chain or the stakeholder network in this slide. But if we start up the top with the agricultural industry, this can be the supply industry, the service industry like labs, etc., or the industry in terms of purchasing grain, crops, etc. And these all have these actors all have a very significant input on the farmer and the decision making. Obviously, it's in a policy context. Many of our farmers are operating under European rules or national rules as they may be in terms of nutrients, for environmental outcomes, for safety outcomes, etc. So we need to consider policymakers. Obviously, education services, both farmer training, higher level education, and coupled with that is probably researchers that are developing, I suppose, advice for farmers, understanding problems with crop nutrition, with crop management, and developing that primary input for future advice. You have consumers, obviously, that are demanding food, but also consumers that are engaged with, I suppose, environment, other goods and services and ecosystem services that do have an impact and a feedback on what farmers do, and that are very different from probably a number of decades ago. Finance providers in terms of the finance input to buy tools and services, but also in terms of to back farmers as they go about their work. And then on this side, you have those that provide advice, that are more service and help farmers make decisions. So crop agronomists that are out in the field, farm advisors and business advisors in there, and of course agri-contractors, those that are mainly doing some of the work on the farms and do bring about a lot of influence in terms of final decisions. So what did we do? How did we engage stakeholders in this piece of work? In three main ways, I suppose we tried to engage. One was the online survey, which many of you might have participated in. We aimed here for 100 stakeholders per country, and we did pretty well in terms of getting a good spread of stakeholders right across the 9 countries. And you can see there we had 714 respondents, either online on their computers or on their phone. We tried to make this as easy as possible. We followed this up with stakeholder interviews, and that was largely with yourselves as national expert groups. You have knowledge and an overview of what's going on in your countries, and those interviews provided, I suppose, more in-depth knowledge and information back to us in the network. And then finally, we wanted to validate that. So we didn't want to, I suppose, get it wrong, identify things that maybe farmers didn't perceive at the same level of importance. So we fed this information back into the crop nutrition clubs in each country through farmer evaluation workshops. So again, we had 26 of these, 5 to 10 farmers in each of those CNCs, and they came together and basically looked over the responses, the needs, the barriers, the stakeholders who could get involved, and said, yeah, we agree with that. That's our perception, aligns with the general stakeholder perception. So I suppose just before I get into the results, just to show the stakeholder breakdown, those that responded to these 3 methods of engagement. And you can see there across the countries, there was fairly equal representation in terms of the number of stakeholders. Obviously, a big country like France obviously had to cover a lot of geography and has slightly more stakeholders, and then smaller countries had slightly less. But in general, we got a good representation of respondents from across the countries. In terms of the stakeholder groups, farmers and land managers were by far the biggest group that responded, followed by advisory services. So the crop agronomists and farm advisors there in the grey and in the yellow. Industry was represented in terms of support services, grain purchasers, and input sales were all represented. Policymakers, and then we had some others. Also in here was researchers from right across the different countries. So again, it's a good overview in terms of who has responded and what we're likely to get in terms of representation. So some of the results. Drivers and motivations of farmers. What are the main drivers for improving crop nutrition? And you can see there largely production and economics, as we would expect, are driving. Obviously, these farms are businesses, and they must produce crops or produce outputs to be able to sell into the market. So those were the 2 primary drivers. Following that, obviously, market specification. So they're trying to produce a crop for, differentiated markets. And also policy and environment are coming in here in terms of the primary motivations to get crop nutrition and nutrient management correct. Obviously, with pressure coming on from nitrates directive, greenhouse gas challenges, etc., nutrients and specifically nitrogen is to the fore, nitrogen and phosphorus. In terms of primary motivations then, again, as expected, aligned with the drivers, you would have yield potential to increase yield potential, reduce fertilizer costs, increase crop quality, and they stack up with the drivers. And other ones, increase soil fertility, so long-term goals on the farm, and then compliance with policy and I suppose environmental policy. So I suppose nothing out of the ordinary here, but does set the scene in terms of that farmers right across Europe were on the same page, and depending on the different countries, these drivers and motivations changed very, very little. In terms of what information's out there currently on farms, so soil test results are to the fore. Crop type information and crop yield information is very much to the fore. And then other things in terms of different types of analysis, crop nutrient balances, and obviously in season and at the end of the season analysis of the crops is lesser, I suppose, in terms of the information that's available on the farm. And this kind of builds a picture of what farmers have to hand in terms of making decisions in terms of crop nutrition. In terms of tools and technologies then to support or to feed in that information to help make the final decision. Obviously, soil nutrient analysis results comes up here again. Recommendations at a national and regional level. Computer systems and IT systems to help nutrient management planning. Precision technology comes in here, including variable rate here technology as well. And then results, sensors, etc. are lesser being used on farms. So again, you can see the picture there of what's happening on farms at the moment, what data is available, and what was, I suppose, most surprising for us in terms of this stock take is the level of accuracy that was perceived, given the information that's available and given the tools and technologies that are being used on some farms. The level of accuracy by and large was only moderate. You can see here 66% or 2/3 of the respondents perceived the level of accuracy to be moderate, and a further 17% to be very low. So again, we have a lot done maybe, and a lot more to do in terms of supporting farmers to up their game and to get a better impact in terms of crop nutrition. How are they assessing this? Previous practice on farm seems to be the big one, followed by lookup tables at national level, and to a lesser extent then nutrient management planning systems, environmental limits, and 25% or a quarter of respondents are still kind of sticking their finger in the air and saying, I think it's good or I think it's bad. They don't really have the evidence, and they're guessing or estimating the requirements on their farms. How do farmers judge success? Again, comparison with previous yields, the visual appearance of crops, and to a lesser extent, analysis in terms of the nutrient analysis, the in-crop analysis, or using technologies like yield mapping, etc. So again, it's comparison with last year. If last year was a poor year because of weather, etc., obviously farmers get a better feeling that their crop nutrition is better in the subsequent year. However, is that the case, and is that fact? And the visual appearance of crops, that can be good. It does give a good feel-good factor. However, do you really have the evidence by looking at the crop that you've done well in terms of recovering the nutrients that you've applied? Just finally then into the final piece of this, the challenges and barriers to adoption. So what did farmers perceive as the main challenges to adoption of tools and getting more from the information that they maybe have on the farm and are collecting on an annual basis? And how could they do better by adopting some technologies? So in terms of the main ones, the cost of the tools and technologies and low farmer income. And obviously farm size being too small to carry these costs. So costs come to the fore as the first three barriers that were identified. Lack of farmer awareness and education were the next three. So they're just not aware of what's out there or how it can be used on their farms or implemented on their farms to get more precision. And then things like the agronomist and advisor or the agri-contractor takes that decision making maybe away from the farmer and they're not as involved. So that's the next ones. Other things then, you know, old habits die hard, traditions, etc., lack of time, you know, responding to environment policy, which creates confusion, are to a lesser extent perceived as being the main challenges and barriers. In terms of the main farmers' needs identified or linked with these challenges and barriers, education seems to come to the fore. Awareness and demonstration of the tools, which is a form of education, again being the second one. Access to finance, the two green bars here. Availability of independent research results, and also the availability of economic cost benefits. So they're unsure that if they invest in something that it'll pay back, it'll give a return on that investment, and obviously government incentives to prop things up. Obviously lack of farmer income, etc. You can see how incentives coming from centrally would be perceived as a main need. Second last slide, I suppose, looking across the country. So what I've presented in the short time that we have here for the meeting is the average or the consensus across all 9 countries. However, when we delve into the countries, things do turn out a little bit different, but not that different. So the overarching messages are that education seems to be, an awareness seem to come to the fore. Industry, incentives from industry, incentives from government, and access to finance. So the green level bars are very prominent. And obviously then to a lesser extent, research results, economic cost benefit in some of the countries, and in some of the other countries, you can see they're very prominent as the red bars in there. However, I think by conducting this analysis, this stakeholder engagement, it has given us in the network food for thought. I hope you as practitioners in the industry that this information that we've shared with you gives you food for thought in terms of upping the game and what we might do going forward. And, you know, who can best support farmer in these needs from the farmer's perspective? Professional farm advisors, agronomists, agricultural universities and farmer training. So that education piece and advice piece is certainly to the fore. However, industry is very big in here. It mightn't have prominence when you add these bars for industry together. You get more prominence, and obviously finance and policymakers play a big role here as well in terms of supporting. So it's going to take a multi-actor approach to help farmers to achieve a better impact and a better outcome here. So in conclusion, production and economic drivers do motivate farmers. However, obviously environmental drivers and other social drivers are certainly there and probably growing. Data and information is being collected on farms, and some tools and technologies are being used. However, 2/3 of farms perceived to have a very low accuracy, low or moderate accuracy in terms of their crop nutrition. So, you know, the sky's the limit there in terms of trying to achieve something better. Many challenges and barriers to adoption of tools were identified in this piece of analysis: awareness and education, income and access to finance, and access to advice, access to people seem to be to the fore. Farmers' needs identifies here in this piece of analysis will feed into the work package and tasks within the NUTRI-CHECK network. And finally, ye as members of the National Expert Group and wider stakeholders, we will engage with you further to try to help overcome these challenges and barriers, and to work with you in collaboration to develop solutions for farmers. So with that, I'll leave it there, and we'll move to some questions or some breakout groups. So back to you.
Yes. Thank you, David. Yeah, thank you. David, there's a question in the chat from Gert Pedersen Holm.
Okay.
He's saying the cost of technology is based on the member states are supporting purchase of machines and not supporting the use of best practice fertilizer technology in the member states. So what do we want to support the farmer to use? I think it should be use technology or the farmer to buy technology.
Yeah, a very good question, and it depends on the specific technology that's being used. So yes, there is some machinery on the farm to help in terms of application. More so, I suppose what we're really concerned with here is the decision making in the first place. So again, you know, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to buy a piece of technology. You may buy access to the service or to the service provider, for that matter, and a backup service, and that's a very good point. However, the cost benefit analysis piece, farmers came very much to the fore, and even in terms of those technologies that we don't necessarily need to purchase outright. Farmers are unsure in terms of whether there's a return for that smaller investment in access to the service or the time needed to engage with the service provider. And that's something that we do need to delve into and overcome. It's a social science piece, I would say, as well as a biophysical research piece, but certainly the social science here comes very much to the fore, social and economic sciences. And that's the piece that we need to break down those barriers.
Yes. Thank you, David.
Yes, so I think everybody can see my first slide now, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
We can
perfect.
see the screen, your presentation.
Right, so hi, my name is Milan Fransen from the Netherlands. I'm a project manager at Delphi, background soil science, and I have the honor of explaining something about the process of identifying digital tools for nutrition management, specifically for a European context. As most of you, well, I think every one of us can attest to, digitalization is increasingly influencing our lives for better or for worse, but not my words, but a lot of way smarter people than mine. They say it's not the problem is not the technology, it's how we use it. And I think specifically for agriculture, the support of nutrition management decisions can be greatly improved if we integrate digital tools in our decision making. But of course, there's always a question of the costs of analysis and the cost of interpretation of those analysis and the value or perceived value of what is being gained from that. To let you wait no further. Yeah. All right. So I've divided this presentation in a few aspects. So firstly, I'll introduce a bit more about the context of the digital tools within this project and in a European context. Then I'll explain a bit more how we went about this inventory of tools. And of course, although this is still an ongoing process, so we don't have any final results yet, I can give you some examples of tools which might be interesting to you. And then, of course, I'm not an oracle, so I cannot tell you exactly what's going to happen in the next few years, but I can give you some indication of what's going to happen throughout this project, which I'll be doing thereafter. And of course, if I don't talk too much, then we'll have time for some questions. So to start off with a short introduction, this table is not my work, but it's sort of a summary of the adoption of different tools throughout the different members of this project, the member countries. You see here a lot of different technologies on the y-axis and the level of adoption for each of the countries which are participating. If it's green, it means that more than 10% of arable land area is making use of this specific tool. And what's noteworthy at this is, well, I think we can all agree that there's a lot of technologies available, but far from all of these technologies are even being used by for 10% or more of the arable land area. Well, then comes the next question, okay, but maybe the cost of these technologies is too high. But still, you see quite a big difference between the countries, whether or not they make use of these different technologies. And you might ask yourself the question, is this because it's not useful for our countries, or is it because some companies are not active in all countries, or it's simply because knowledge is not sufficiently being shared by national systems? Well, to get back on this, if you want to maximize the action potential for farmers, I think the answer to each of those questions is we should facilitate maximum knowledge transfer, because yeah, if something works at one place, then you should at least see if it has added value in another place. And additionally, a lot of these technologies, they're being integrated into a platform, for instance. And in the end, only if you are able to integrate those different technologies into a platform, then you can actually have farmers to see, okay, does this aid my decision making on nutrition use? So there's a lot of attempts going on to integrate these tools by individual actors or by communal actors. But yeah, we do see a real need based on this table of more integration and more knowledge sharings. And of course, to weigh the cost of information, because not as well in my discussion group just now, it was mentioned, for instance, in the Netherlands, we have very fertile soils. If you compare that to regions where the soils are way less fertile, it might not serve to have exactly the same nutrient analysis of the soil, for instance. Well, shortly, the project aim, I'm not going to go over this whole sentence, but to put it bluntly, the project wants to create a network for cross-pollination and knowledge sharing. And yeah, if the neighbors use something, we must know why they use it, how it's being used, and if it's relevant to us. And if we do something, then the neighbors must know the same about us. I think that's the best route towards a total added value for everyone. And yeah. So specifically for the identification of tools and services. So in the project, we aim to identify services and tools that might aid crop nutrient management decision-making. And also we want to evaluate the value of these existing nutrient management recommendation systems. So as Sarah already mentioned in the beginning, we're not here to design a whole new systems and whole new practices, but we are trying to evaluate what is available and see what we can gain from this as a whole. Well, we have a whole bunch of tools which we already evaluated. Of those whole bunch, we want to select 50 that will be evaluated by the national expert groups, and some of which can then be trialed in practice by the crop nutrition clubs, so by the farmer groups for each individual partner. Of course, in the end, the results of this, so to get best practices, to get the best tools supporting these best practices, want to be able to put that on a platform which should be available to each of you and to each farmer later in the project. Right now, this is still in progress, so we are not able to provide a full mapping of all the information of each of the tools provided. So far, we were able to identify 220 tools. If you add all the numbers here, you will find more than 220. But to put it more bluntly, there were 135 tools that were surveyed. And each of the countries that were noted in those surveys as being a target country, they were put in this graph. And we do see that there's a lot of tools that target a lot of different countries around Europe, even beyond Europe, if you look at some of the results. What's interesting is that pretty much only Yara was the tool that was mentioned by more than 2 partners, so by more than 2 countries. Whereas other tools, for instance, like Haifa, they have a nutrient management platform. They mentioned that they are active in 10 plus countries, but only one of the partners managed to find this tool and to bring it in. So we do see here that a tool might say that they're active more widely, But then the question remains, are they actually being recognized by different countries, by different type of farmers? Because if we as experts have some issues identifying these tools, then yeah, it might be that the farmers might also not find them. If we then look at what did we identify, which type of tools? So on the left pie graph, you see the main technology or the main aim of the tool. And you see that the far majority of the tools, they are mostly just overall nutrient requirement. So I'm going to make the assumption and say that's mostly upfront. And then if you pull together the nutrient offtakes, the RGB imagery, the NDVI, the green area index, and the yield map, you actually say, okay, these are the type of tools that have the primary objective or the primary tool indicator to assess development during the season. Of course, this is the way the survey was put up. There is the option to have the primary aim. So there might still be secondary aims or secondary technologies which are incorporated into the tool, but it does give us some indication of the primary technology or aim of the tool. Then if we look at the tools for which this was filled in, the level of detail which is being evaluated by the tool, well, there's a small minority that says, hey, we can actually do on all scales, but the majority of tools, they're focusing on field scale. So they don't necessarily take heterogeneity of a field into account unless, for instance, you use a soil sampling and you put a bulk sample of multiple spots in the soil. That's an option that's to the farmer themselves, but the tool itself doesn't necessarily take that into account. Some other tools, for instance, was mentioned previously, the satellite imagery. It's also one that's being mentioned. Rotation level, of course, it's also a logical one. And there's even quite a few tools that are focusing on the whole farm scale. Well, the question that remains then is, okay, if somebody answered this question as being on a whole farm scale, do they mean that it's just an aggregate number on the whole farm, or they say, no, this tool enables to have the different field on a whole farm and then make a budget for the whole farm? So that's some things that we still need to figure out. As said, this is an ongoing process. Well, then a bit more concrete, because yeah, we do want to show some interesting tools to you. I have a few tools which I prepared. I'm only going to go over them quite briefly. So it's TipStar, which is it's a side dressing, top dressing model which can be used for potatoes. Nutrient management planner from Ireland. Then Farm Maps, which is a free tool which can be used modularly with other tools from the Netherlands. Then we have Data Farming from Austria, and of course, to take one that's more internationally acknowledged, and we're going to have the Yara grain analysis. So the first one, the TipStar, there's way more to this tool than I can describe right now. But in essence, it's a growth model for potatoes, and it can calculate either your potential additional yield, or you can even use it to trace back which moments in time you could have had more yield, but either moisture, temperature, or nitrogen was limiting. So pretty much what it says is, what is your added value of adding more nitrogen? And what's very interesting about this one is that, for instance, you say you have a data forecast which is mid-July, then it can take the actual weather forecast for the coming 2 weeks to assess, okay, how much mineralization is likely to be there, how much moisture is likely to be there, and which adjustments could you make to try to retain or to try to stick towards somewhat an optimal yield curve. If you want to look further ahead, it can do that. And in the Netherlands, we have 30 years of, the model uses 30 years of historical weather data to assess, okay, listen, we're right now at this point, half of July, the next 14 days, we know, give or take, what's the weather going to be. And thereafter, we're just going to keep on estimating based on the 30 years we still have. It can give you quite a nice idea of how much nitrogen to use, and also how much irrigation to apply. So quite an interesting tool. It's available in English, so I would definitely motivate everyone to take a look at this one for yourself. Next one is NMP Online. It's an Irish tool. It's well, same as the previous one. It's a nutrient planning program, but this one is for way more nutrients, and it's based on the so-called Green Book. So this is a national recommendation-based advisory base for fertilization in Ireland, and it focuses a lot, based on what I've read, it focuses a lot on the return on investment. So if you look at, if an accountant says this is an interesting investment to make, they also look at your soil as an accountant would. So what is the return on investment, how quickly, or what is the largest risk if you don't invest? So they base it on soil analysis, the crop type, and of course the nutrient requirement corresponding to this crop type. And as you can see in the little graph here, it follows different curves throughout the season and also gives a recommendation on which type of fertilizer to be used, both organic and inorganic, because yeah, as we all know, different type of fertilizer have different rates of mineralization and nutrients becoming available. So the next one I have is also a very interesting one, and as opposed to staying in the PowerPoint, we're gonna go quickly to a small demo. Can somebody confirm if you can see my browser now?
Yeah, we can, Milan.
Okay, beautiful. So this is actually at FarmMaps. It's very easy to make an account. It's quite quite a bad thing that I'm borrowing my colleagues' FarmMaps, but forget about that. Could have made one myself. And we can see here for different fields, for different farms, you can load them in. This is all fully free, fully available. And you can see, for instance, NDVI imagery. You can see the biomass. You can even look at different ways of showing this. You can even look back. What was the biomass? But as you can see here, as it's a free tool, one could argue you would prefer to have maybe a bit smaller pixel size, a bit higher precision. This also, because FarmMaps is a larger platform, for instance, TipStar, the tool that I mentioned firstly, was also mentioned there. You can, for instance, also have a blight risk indicator and to see which management practices should I do at which moment for your potato. Well, as you can see, there's a lot of options here. So it's quite an interesting tool to look at, and also to see, okay, the modularity of this type of tool. You can select a whole different range of applications that you can load into this tool, and yeah, that can be of value to the decision making of the farmer. So that also shows that not necessarily you need to have all the information in a single tool, but a platform that can integrate different tools and to have them interact with each other, either this or with iFlow Manager or DACOM. It's all very interesting. Next one is an Austrian example, which is it's quite similar to the previous one, but then Austrian version, at least from my understanding. And it's also here. It's like a freemium type. So you get the free NDVI imagery, but if you want to have a more high resolution imagery, then it becomes paid. It offers options to connect different types of tools, so you can stack your performance of your field over time, so you can benchmark it within your own farm. How are my fields performing over time, and do I need to change for instance, my VRA application? You can use auto zoning for the specific VRA application. It is interchangeable with other platforms, so you can take your data out. And also an interesting one, for instance, you have this newer type of EC sensors that you can put behind or in front of your tractor. And then that enables you to cross-validate this with your imagery. And then, yeah, it gives you an even better idea of which soil characteristics am I dealing with and how can I act on this with my task maps. Then the last one, and maybe the most known to everyone here, because it's from Yara, it's internationally known. It's the grain analysis for wheats and other types of grains. So this one is more specifically used for benchmarking afterwards. So you know, in hindsight, after you've done the analysis, okay, did all my nutrition get to the right place? Was the plant able to prioritize its grain, and was anything lacking? It's mostly being used for subsequent crops. That's the main benefit of it. But I mean, it's still a very valuable tool to be able to look back and say, hey, this is what I should have done differently. And of course, here again, you can go for a more standard type of approach, or you can go to a more broad spectrum to see, hey, maybe a single micronutrient is missing that's blocking potentially some enzymatic reaction in my grain. So what's next? We've seen a few tools, and there's way more to be checked. The inventory is still ongoing. And of course, we also want to be open to new tools being delivered, new tools becoming available. So for now, the first thing we're going to do is to prioritize the tools for the expert groups and the farmers clubs, so that you can give your assessment on which tools are valuable, and that the farmers can have some experience with tools that they see as having the most potential for added value. From this, we will also want to be able to identify some best practices, because in the end, you can have a valuable tool, but if the tool is not necessarily being spread across all partners, then at least you can know which practices work for which locations, which situations. And of course, if you want to be able to access all of this, you need to have an online platform to access all of this from all the partners and non-partners. So in the end, what we want is availability of knowledge. We want availability of best practices and tools to, in the end, throughout the EU, but also beyond, optimize crop nutrition. That was it for me. So if anybody has any questions, don't hesitate.
The UK, are you ready to share your presentation, Roger?
Can you see it, Randy?
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And it's a real honor to be able to address you all across Europe. I have been in crop nutrition for 50 years, and I did not expect to be saying something that I regard as new. But I think what I'm going to say is relatively new. We were asked in the UK to talk about our work with grain analysis, but in thinking about grain analysis in the lead up to the start of this project, and then during the last year, and particularly in discussion with our national expert group and our crop nutrition clubs, it's become clear to us that grain analysis raises much sort of fundamental questions about our nutritional strategies, and the way we make decisions and the way we make checks. And of course, checks and management have to interact. So I'm going to try and address the questions of whether we should prioritize measurements of soil or of crop. And generally, I would argue that we have to measure the crop if we want to measure our success. And secondly, in relation to our decisions, should we be thinking of these checks as informing the decision just before it's made and helping the prediction of the right decision, or should we be using these decisions, the checks after the decision is made, and therefore using it as a learning tool to try and work out how we could have done better? And I've got about 10 slides, and I'm fairly sure I won't have time to show them all. So I'm just going to refer you to other versions of this talk. One was given to the Fertilizer Society in December last year. And if you're a member of the International Fertilizer Society, this is available as a written and as a spoken paper. And you were all circulated with this document, which came from the COMIFA conference that was held last month, where my paper was called Crop Nutrition Measure to Manage. And there's a shorter paper there that will give some more of the detail. But essentially, what we're thinking is that we need to be deciding, and this applies whether we're talking about small parts of a field or whole fields or even whole farms, or even if we're managing regions, if we're a fertilizer company or a government, we need to be thinking of how we of it as process management. So if we were managing a factory and it had inputs and it had products or outputs, we would have to be measuring both the products and the outputs, and the inputs, sorry, the inputs and the products. Now, most processes have losses, and most processes use storage for their inputs. So and losses are usually very difficult to measure. So if you measure your inputs and your outputs and you monitor your storage, then you can work out roughly what your losses might have been. And so really what we're thinking of, and Sarah's already shown this slide, what we're thinking of is that we should apply this process management philosophy to crop nutrition. And I mean, I need to present this as this is suggestions for what we should be discussing in our national expert groups and our crop nutrition clubs. This is something that we've developed over the last year or two, and we're not at all confident that it is going to be helpful. So we need this project to try and work out whether this sort of thinking is going to be helpful. So if we look at the crop nutrition as a process, then we, as Sarah's already said, we have losses to air and losses to water. We have soil stores. We measure the inputs. In fact, the fertilizer companies have to, by regulation, they have to quote the nutrient contents of the fertilizers that we buy. We're going to hear about manure management in a minute, and it's, I would argue, very important that we measure the manure inputs of nutrients as well as the fertilizer inputs. We do monitor soils, but as Sarah said, that's incomplete and it's imprecise. And we don't, as a result of what we measure at the moment, at the decision scale, which is normally the field scale, as I think we've already heard today, we are not able to monitor our losses. And that's a big Achilles heel, or it's a big problem for a manager if they can't measure their losses or even estimate their losses. So what we're looking at is whether by analyzing our outputs, our nutrient outputs, whether that can improve our estimates of our losses, our inefficiencies, and as a result, our learning. So there are two main purposes of analyzing, and I like to call it harvest analysis rather than grain analysis. We've only used this on grain so far, but this project covers potatoes and maize. So there are other sorts of products than grains. And I would like to think this philosophy applies to them too, but we need to work through that, I think, in the project. So first of all, if we can express the nutrients that we harvest in kilograms per hectare, we can relate those, first of all, the crop capture to the amounts of fertilizer that, or manure nutrient that we've applied, and the difference will basically give us an estimate of potential loss. And if we can compare our crop capture with our offtakes, that will give us an estimate of the residue that's been left to carry over into the next cycle of crop production. But secondly, and we're all familiar with analyzing soils and leaves, we're less familiar with analyzing grains, but it's still the same philosophy applies. If you express the results from the laboratory as a percentage in the dry matter of the crop, you can actually interpret that according to whether that crop was deficient, sufficient, or had an excessive supply, because the concentrations of nutrition are specifically related to the balance between demand and supply of the crop. So I'm just going to quickly, as I can, talk through the kilograms per hectare and then the percent dry matter. So the kilograms per hectare, you have to measure your yield. And I imagine that most people in this workshop would find farmers who were measuring their yield. In fact, in my experience, it's actually a relatively recent thing that good yield records are maintained and recorded year on year, field by field, farm by farm. We've really struggled to understand yield data, and that's really the initial reason why we set up the Yield Enhancement Network, or the YEN. So good yield records, but then you also need to analyze the grain. And in fact, analyzing the grain is a more precise and easy exercise than actually analyzing leaves or soils, because you don't have to walk across the fields. The grain comes to the store. You just take 2 handfuls out of each load that comes into the store, and that gives you a very good, because it's so thoroughly mixed, representation of what the nutrients what is being harvested from that part of the field. And we've developed these guidelines that you can get from the YEN website that help you through that process of doing the sampling and then sending to the laboratory. And I just want to show you the variation that we're seeing amongst just wheat crops in the UK. We've been doing all grain crops, but this is just for wheat crops. So we've got 1,700 different YEN fields where wheat has been grown, yield has been measured, and the grain concentrations have been measured. And I've just put the N, P, and K up here. We do all the nutrients, but just N, P, and K. And what you see there is a similar level of variation to the variation we see in yield. And certainly when you look at micronutrients, the variation is more than the variation in yield. So there is a lot of variation, and that's the main message to take away, because at the moment, the rules that we have in our recommendation systems advocate assuming one value for each of those concentrations for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those are the standard concentrations, and generally the standard concentrations for phosphorus and potassium have exceeded the average value that we've been measuring in UK crops. So there's possibly been oversupply of phosphorus and potassium in the last few decades because of that inaccuracy. Nitrogen has generally been measured and is generally measured for quality monitoring, but that often means it's not relatable to the decisions made on each field by field. And most of what we know about the variation is down to the variety. And I've shown the feed and milling values that we use in the UK there, but you can see that the variation is much bigger than that, and therefore we need to understand that in order to understand the consequences of our decisions. So analysis of grain does seem worthwhile. Now, this is purely a suggestion. This whole slide here is a suggestion of how we might develop in NUTRI-CHECK a reporting system, or a thinking system, if you like, that goes through the accounting for nutrition from beginning to end. So we start you can see all the nutrients are across the top. So we've got the macronutrients and then the micronutrients, macronutrients in kilograms per hectare, micronutrients in grams per hectare. And then down the side, we have the order of accounting, if you like, accounting thinking that we have to do in order to understand the consequences of our decisions. So first of all, we set up a budget, which depends on the expected yield and the normal concentration of a nutrient. Then we measure the soil supply and the soil availability, and the difference between those two effectively gives us the quantity of nutrient that we need to apply. And then if we do this analysis at harvest, then we have a quantity that is captured, which we can adjust for what is in the straw, because we find fairly stable relationships between what is in the straw and what is in the grain, so that we can work out the amount that is actually taken off at harvest, and we can look at the difference between that and what was applied in order to give us an idea of the soil balance. And it's, soil balance may be not exactly what we want. We may want to estimate losses, or we may want to quote efficiencies, but all those things are dependent on having this harvest analysis. So harvest analysis requires yet another use of the laboratory. But for me, the laboratories are key to good nutrient management of all sorts. So I'm not saying forget soil analysis at all. I'm saying increase soil analysis if possible. Leaf analysis will help feed into making decisions, but as Sarah said, it's the analysis at the end that tells us how successful that we have been. Now, the concentrations, I haven't got an idea of when I've got to stop. I don't know whether Randy can tell me, but the concentrations, let's just think about that. Unfortunately, we don't have just a simple speedometer that tells us whether our crop was deficient or excessive in its capture of nutrients. So what we've done in the yield enhancement network is to sort of represent the results from an analysis going from low to high. If we've got knowledge of a critical value, then we'll use it, but we have very incomplete knowledge of critical values. So what we do is to share the analytical information between all the farms involved in the network, so that the box and whiskers there show us all the values, the full range of values, the middle 50% of values and the middle value, and that allows us to compare our value with all the current values, the comparable values from this year or from this variety or from this soil type, so that we're looking now at improving the benchmarking technology so that we can do this if people are willing to do the analysis and share the results anonymously. So this is an example of a report from the network. So you can see 6 fields have been analysed, and the 6 fields are across the top. So each column is a different field. And then we have all 12 nutrients down the left-hand side. And the way we interpret these reports is to look, first of all, across all fields to see whether there's a consistent trend for a particular nutrient across all fields. And you can see in this case, there's been a generous supply of sulfur across all fields. In fact, this farm shows generosity generally, and we do find that a lot of the variation is between farms. So that really re-emphasizes the importance of farms operating on their own, but comparing with each other. If we look down the column, we can see whether all nutrients have been low or high for a particular crop. If they're all low, it generally indicates, particularly if the soil analysis has been satisfactory, it indicates that there's been some uptake problem, and that then will feed us through to what we should be managing. And if there's an individual low value, then we'll have to take that forward and look to see how that compares with the soil levels and the fertilizer applications and so on. So there's a huge amount of learning that you can get out of this grain nutrient benchmarking. So to summarize, we've concluded, and this is being wise very late. I don't know whether it is wise, but wise very late in my career, that any manager must check their outputs as well as their inputs. If we're not doing that, to be honest, I don't think we're managing. So farmers do check their inputs if they're applying fertilizers. We need to think of the next talk, because that's about the organic inputs. Harvest nutrients vary a lot in concentration, and that's not all related to the yield. So we need to treat those grain measurements, those harvest measurements, as particularly important compared to the other checks we're making. The harvest reporting depends on analysis and then sharing the results so that we can do the benchmarking, because we don't have the information on critical values for all nutrients in all crops. The value, I know Milan, I think, said grain analysis costs money. It does cost money, but it's tens of euros per field, compared with the average value of doing that, which we've estimated to be thousands of euros per field. So there's a huge cost benefit advantage of that. Now, just to say, we've been doing this in the UK for cereals, oilseeds and pulses. We need to think about doing it in this project with potatoes and maize. But I better stop there, because I can see Randy's face saying, please stop. and I don't know whether there's time for discussion.
Yes, thank you, Roger. There's time for discussion. And I can see that there is question in the chat. There's one from Gil William that says, nutrient concentration are related to yield level 2. In general, they are lower when yield is higher. How do you deal with this?
Sorry, Randy, I didn't.
Oh, can you hear me, Roger?
Well, I can hear you, but
Yeah.
I wasn't concentrating because I was trying to find the written version, and I can't find the written version. The question was?
Yeah, I'll read the question again. Nutrient concentration are related to yield level 2. In general, they are lower when yield is higher. How do you deal with this?
Well, that is a very important question, and thank you for asking it. And the answer is yes, of course, the nutrient levels, but generally, and I know much more about nitrogen than I do about other nutrients, because I spent most of my career looking at nitrogen, but generally we've concluded that higher yielding crops need larger nutrient supplies. So you would expect that if you're getting nutrient dilution, that it indicates a need for a bigger supply. We need to look at that for other nutrients than nitrogen, though.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Are there any more questions for Roger? Yes, Harm.
Yeah,
I can see that. Yes.
You showed that it's rather easy to take a very nice representative sample for cereals. But when you want to go to other crops, like you mentioned potatoes, that might be a bit more difficult to find a good sample.
Yes. I am not at all experienced with potatoes, and I can well understand that will be true. But I would argue, without knowing the detail, that we need to try. Mm-hmm. Because if we're worried about losses or efficiency or any of these things, and if we're worried about learning whether our current recommendations are largely, and I think this is true, whether they're published national recommendations or they're in a digital tool, they're all rules which have no checks. Mm-hmm. All the checks are made to improve the sophistication of the rule following, but not to check whether the decision was right in the end. And we all know that yields vary enormously depending on the weather, the soil, the diseases, the weeds, all these things. So we need to measure after the decision.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sharing. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present a tool we have elaborated in Denmark. It's a part of our crop management systems, and in generally we call it e-gylle. Gylle means slurry in Danish, and e is electronic. We don't make electronic slurry, but we try to make the data transfer about slurry electronical, so we can utilize the slurry better. And I should introduce to you why we did it and how we have done it. First, I'll just introduce our decision support tools. We have 3 tools actually, which is in the same family because they are all connected to the same database, the Danish field database. If we start with the lower one, Mark Online, is a tool mainly for crop advisors. They use it more or less all year round, planning fertilizer plans, crop rotation, varieties, and they use it for the application for single payment for the advisor, for the farmers. So they use that all the time. It's the crop advisor's main tool. The next one is the crop manager, which is an in-season tool for farmers and managers, so they can monitor their farms and make decisions during the season with the tool, and also use it for variable N rates and stuff like that. The last one is the farm tracking, which is actually the tractor driver's tool, and he's using that for registering what he's doing in the field. So today I have spread 200 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare on field 22 or something like that. So everything can be registered in that tool. It's an app for the phone and very easy to use. The three, as I mentioned, the three tools are all sharing the same database, so data is flowing from one tool to the other. And to the farmer, it's very important and very easy to use, because most of the data is put into the database through Mark Online during the season. So a lot of the data the farmers need to use is already in there. So the farmers it's not necessary for the farmer to register anything to get started. eGULE is improving the data in the database, and by doing that, we can improve the fertilizer plan. That is the whole idea with the project, and the tool is to improve the fertilizer plan during the season. In the database, we have data of more or less all fields in Denmark. I think we have about 90% of the total farm area is covered by the database. And for a lot of fields, we have data all the way back to the 90s. So we have data for 25 or 30 years on most of the fields. So it's very well covered, and we have a lot of data about the farms and the fields in the database. And of course, the farmer has access to all the data through mainly Crop Manager. The challenge making a fertilizer plan is huge. It's very easy to make a fertilizer plan, but the fertilizer plan must be precise and it must be updated throughout the season, so it's updated all the time. The farmers are advisors, they're actually using quite a lot of time optimizing it, so it should be maintained and updated throughout the season. A lot of things are pretty precise in the fertilizer plan, but one piece of information is imprecise. That is the utilized amount of nitrogen in the applied manure. And as you know, Denmark is a huge animal production country, and we have a lot of slurry. So most farms are using some amount of slurry or digested biomass in the fertilizer plant. So we need to improve the information about that. We have got an example of a very simple fertilizer plan in a winter wheat field. I excuse it. It's in Danish. Just need to move this. Yeah. But what you can see here is that according to the plan, 165 kilograms of nitrogen should be applied to this field. A lot of information can be used to put this figure right, and we assume here that it's quite accurate. So we actually want to aim for 165 kilograms of nitrogen. According to the fertilizer plan, we have a 3-split application. First, in March, we have applied 41 kilograms of nitrogen in mineral fertilizer. the 1st of April, we applied slurry from pigs, and we have a third application in May, where we apply another 41 kilograms in mineral fertilizer. Together, it sums up to 155 kilograms of nitrogen. Perfect. However, we assume 83 kilograms of utilized nitrogen in the slurry. Is that right? It may be right, but it may not be right. Today we calculated from standard figures of what's in the slurry, and here the standard figure says 4.5 kilograms of nitrogen per ton. We have planned to apply 32 kilograms per hectare, and we have assumed that the inefficiency would be 58% of the total nitrogen content in the slurry will be utilized. These three figures multiplied together gives us 83 kilograms of nitrogen. But all the three figures here are unprecise, and we can improve that, and we can do that easily. Already today, we've been doing that for many years. We can make an analysis of the manure, send it to the laboratory and get an analysis back, so we can improve that figure. We can ask the driver of the slurry trailer, how many tons did you actually end up applying per hectare? And we can make a calculation based on the data of the manure and weather and stuff like that. So we can improve the calculation of the efficiency. So we've been able to do that for many years, but in practice, only very few farmers actually do it because it's difficult and it takes time. By fertilizing by standard figures, that gives us some troubles because we won't hit the right amount every time. We would quite often be quite off what we expect. And the result will be that some fields will get too much nitrogen. That will give us problems with lodging, which gives us problems with difficult harvest, and it will increase the nitrate leaching. And some other fields will get too little nitrogen, which lead to yield losses and a reduced protein level in the grain. So we need to improve that. And it's actually quite simple. Here I've got an example on a farm where my colleague Leif Knudsen had a project a few years ago. On the farm, there was 8 different slurry tanks with quite a lot of manure in it. The concentration of nitrogen was measured during the project, and after that he could Leif calculated what would be the benefit of using accurate numbers instead of standard numbers. And he could calculate that just by doing that, he could increase the yield by 0.06 tons per hectare, would be equivalent to something like 12 euros per hectare. And it would also reduce the nitrate leaching by about 1 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And it will decrease the amount of lodging and makes an easier harvest. So there's a lot of benefits by just doing things easily, by doing things better. But it's still a challenge to make farmers doing it because it's there's so many difficulties in handling the data. It takes time, costs money. Maybe the data disappears somewhere on the way. The slurry analysis may come from the laboratories on a mail to the farmer, but the the data is not coming from the mail to the Mark Online, so then it doesn't really matter. And the data must be registered manually, so it comes on a piece of paper and it has to be registered in the programs manually. And even though the farmer and the advisors manage to do it, it may be too late in the season for changing anything. So it's too late for future actions. And in reality, too few farmers are actually doing it. So that's why we need to do all this automatically. So we have, to our system, developed a data transfer system where everything is done over the air and automatically, so nothing has to be done manually. Everything starts up in Mark Online, where the slurry application is planned, and by planning, each task is given a unique identification number. So which means we can take those data and send it to the slurry trailer. So on the slurry trailer, the driver can see, okay, it's planned that this field should have 32 tons of slurry per hectare. And when he's applying the slurry, the machine is collecting a supplied file, and the average amount of slurry can be transferred back to the system. So the task now is enriched with the actually applied amount of slurry, both in average of the whole field and actually also on every spot of the field. So we have an as applied map. If the slurry trailer is equipped with the NIR sensor, for example, or NMR sensor, which can detect the nutrient content of the slurry during application, these data can be enriched to the dataset as well. If we don't, we can get automatically transferred analysis data from the laboratory. So now we have enriched the dataset with the analysis. These data goes into the what we call nitrogen effect calculator, which is a part of Mark Online, where it's further enriched with the climate or weather data during application and the days after application. And when we have all those data, we can actually calculate the nitrogen effect and put that back into Mark Online, update fertilizer plan, so the next spreading of mineral fertilizer can be adjusted. So the e-Gylle can deliver precise information about the utilized nitrogen in the manure, because we have a precise amount of applied slurry. We have a precise slurry composition from the laboratory or from sensors on the slurry trailer. And we can calculate the N utilization based on the amount of slurry, the slurry composition, and the weather data. If we have local weather data from a weather station, we can utilize that, or we can use standard weather data from the Danish Meteorological Institute. So what's the value for the farmer? We're talking about a lot of precision farming in Denmark and probably across Europe. And we actually think that knowing what you are applying, what amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium for that case that you are actually applying is a very important piece of information in precision farming. I think it has a higher value. There's a high value in precise application between fields, and maybe that's value is even higher than the value of precision farming within the field. We're talking a lot about variable N rate. It's a huge thing in Denmark also, but I think a precise knowledge of what you are applying in slurry is even more important. And if you don't know what you have applied in slurry, I think you should forget all about variable N rate because it's rubbish. And invest your money and time in getting knowledge about what you're applying in slurry would be a better option for you. It's a very important tool for making what we call a dynamic fertilizer planning. It should be easy to make a dynamic fertilizer plan. And by dynamic fertilizer plan, I think it's a fertilizer plan that is actually reflecting reality. So the fertilizer plan should be an active tool that you keep updated. So it's an active tool for you and not just a piece of paper you keep in the drawer because the authorities tell you to have one. It sounds very easy, and actually it works and it is very easy, but still there are challenges for implementation this in practice. One very big challenge we have met and spent a lot of time and effort to solve that is data standardization. It's very, very different how different manufacturers are using data and the data standard they use. However, we think that ISO XML and AgriRouter have made things very easier than it was just a few years ago. So if everyone could agree on that we are using ISO XML as a data standard and use AgriRouter to transfer data between machines, then things would happen much easier. Another thing we have experienced that data collection and transmission of from the collection and transmission of data from the slurry tankers. That's very difficult because we all know that most slurry trailers have flow meters. So you would think that then it should be very, very easy to collect data on what amount of slurry the slurry trailer actually have applied. But these the flow meters in most cases they are not storing the data; they're just showing the data in the tractor. And you need to do something extra to collect that data and actually store it and transfer it back to the system. We also experienced that NIR data and NMR sensors are not reliable yet, so we generally don't really trust data from collected and measured on the slurry trailers, and mostly rely still on laboratory data. And last of all, I think that the farmers and the advisors should get used to that dynamic fertilizer planning. That's a new thing. It's a way of improving things. So fertilizer plan is just a dumb dead thing in a drawer. It's actually a very much alive and updated tool that you keep consulting over the season and keep it updated and keep adjusting it so you keep your fertilization right all the time. Thank you. That was all I've got, and I hope that